Marshall Kosloff, welcome back to Hidden Forces.
Yeah, it's great to be back. I think this is my third appearance, so it's great to be here.
I think so. I think your first appearance was you and Sagar together, and then your second appearance was just you. And it
Yes.
must have been, I can't remember if it was before the Ukraine invasion or
No, it
after
was
when you guys were.
actually yeah, after the Ukraine invasion. First one was before, second one was
Right,
after.
there you go. Right, that's right. That's why I had it mixed up. So it's great having you on, man. I reached out to you sometime last week. We're recording this on Monday, October 30th, because I'd done a number of episodes on the conflict in Israel, this sort of this escalating regional war in the Middle East, and I really felt like I needed a break from like a hard prep episode to speak with someone who could sort of do more assimilation and analysis with me, so we kind of talk some of this stuff out in a way that didn't feel sort of overwhelming. So I thought, I immediately I said Marshall Kosloff. That's who it is. So Marshall, before we start, you do so many things. You publish prolifically on the Realignment, which now you, I think, exclusively host. You and Sagar do AMAs, but Sagar's very busy over there with Breaking Points. But you also have another podcast called The Arsenal of Democracy, which is with the Hudson Institute. I actually don't know how you do it, man. I mean, between those two podcasts, you must publish like every day. And apparently you have like another job too in Austin where you've moved. So just give us like a little update on what has been going on with you. What have you been up to? What are you doing? And where are you publishing?
Yeah, so my superpower, and I think this is why you and I sync well, is I think it's really cool when I get paid to talk to smart people about a world that's incredibly confusing, where it's increasingly clear that not one single person or sector has all the right answers. So that's how I just keep doing it, because once again, I would be interested in these ideas anyways. And it's just really great that we have supporters and mutual audiences and people who are interested in that. But yeah, so my main podcast is The Realignment. I've been running that since 2019. It came out of the Trump moment. 2016 upends the way we think about the world, and a podcast is a great way to explore that. I hosted that with Sagar and Jetty of Breaking Points, and Breaking Points is an independent YouTube news channel. And the reality is I would like to publish three. I'm going to start publishing 4 days a week in the coming month or so. And because Breaking Points is just a daily show, it just doesn't work out of pure scheduling purpose. So Sagar and I do the weekend things. But yeah, Arsenal of Democracy is my new podcast. It's at the Hudson Institute. We're kind of finding our sea legs, but longer term, the idea of the show is basically just going to be everyone agrees that the United States, not everyone agrees, but there's a lot of consensus in DC, in Silicon Valley, and a lot of the communities you and I spend our time in, that the United States has a role as serving as the arsenal of democracy, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in the Middle East, and whether it's in Taiwan and Asia. So I said to myself, like, okay, let's build the space where people are debating and figuring out the actual answers to those questions. Because if there is consensus on an issue, yet we're not solving the issue, that means this is a deeply interesting issue to explore. So that's the underlying thesis statement for the podcast that I think is going to get doubled down on more and more and more, especially after we run through all of the Hudson Institute guests. And then finally, just with UT, there's a place called the Climate Center for National Security. So I'm just be doing a lot of great podcasting there. Austin, because of the university and just the community, has a lot of interesting people running through who are interested in these issues. So it's going to be cool to have a venue in person that way.
So exciting, man. Hudson Institute's a great place to be affiliated with. I think your very first episode was with Walter Russell Mead, who was a guest this week. That episode just published. When you picked the name Arsenal of Democracy, how much of that was literal in terms of the defense industrial base, and how much of it was metaphorical and thinking about the broader sort of diplomatic role that the United States has to play in leading the creation of this new world order that's coming into being, whatever it is, which Joe Biden alluded to in the speech that he gave shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022?
Yeah, I like that question because the answer is both. So on the first level, and you've talked this through a bunch of guests, the defense industrial base just completely atrophied after the end of the Cold War. If you and I were to go back to the year 2014, this just would not be, not only would this not be on our minds, this also wouldn't be on the minds of serious policymakers who are focused on a variety of complicated foreign policy and national security issues. So I just like the idea of putting this focus on the defense industrial base and our ability to produce munitions, our ability to arm both ourselves and our allies just front and center, so that you're just thinking about it that way. I think something that you and I can do as podcasters in this broader ecosystem is put frameworks and memes and just ideas in front of people. So that's the literal term of it. But the second part, though, is the philosophical point. The philosophical point is the United States is in a serious and important debate about what its role is moving forward as we leave the 2010s and move into like the second quarter of the 21st century. And I think at a philosophical level, the arsenal of democracy framework is a framework that I think both sides of the aisle could take something from. I think it provides a lot of like mission focused objectives that are a little less hypothetical. And I also think it also steers to mind like an industry debate, making the reference to World War II. Obviously, I just did an episode with Arthur Herman, who you should actually have on your podcast. He's the author of Freedom's Forge. He's a Hudson colleague. He wrote just like the best popular history of America and business working together, America being the federal government, to arm the U.S. and allies during during World War II. And the key thing that he's been focusing on recently is we use the term arsenal of democracy, but the term that he is increasingly putting into the ecosystem is arsenal of democracies. Because you've had a variety of guests on, like Alex Green, you've had Bridge Colby, and the thing that they are consistently focused on is this idea that we just can't be World War II America anymore. We have World War II level conditions in terms of multiple fronts, near peer adversaries, but just acting as if it's 1941 all over again. We just have to run that playbook. That just doesn't work. I mean, that's a very, I disagree with the two of them on plenty, but I think that's a very useful starting point. So his argument of arsenal of democracies, and this is why it stems from the title of the episode, the title of the show, is that the US still have allies. And unlike in 1941, it's not just going to be the United States. It's not just going to be Detroit or Maryland or Baltimore producing these goods, producing munitions. It's going to be us working with the Germans, and us focusing with the Japanese, and us working with the Australians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I just love like the philosophical construct of it.
And it can't be just us, right? Because the world is different. The supply chains are much more global today than they were. And America doesn't have, and also the things that are being produced are more complicated. So it's not like building a bomber today is a much more complicated task than it was in 1940.
Yes.
Right.
We're not, you know, in Detroit saying we're building a B-24 in like 10 hours. I mean, that isn't the actual number, but that was the metric you were pumping. They were pumping them out. It doesn't work the same way now.
Right. They were, how many were we producing? It was like some incredible number of
tens of thousands.
Right. It was like one every 5 minutes or something, some insane number. So let me ask you this. Let's take a step back, Marshall, and let me ask you the question this way. When you look at, so I feel like these conversations are relevant to everyone from the standpoint that everyone is a citizen in a democracy where we all have a vote, and it's a participatory democracy. I get it's not perfect, but it's a democracy. And so we all have a responsibility to be informed citizens and try to do our best. That's my view, at least, in participating and sort of tilling the soil of the country, because we're a required part of the process. As a citizen who wants to be informed and understand the world, what, in your view, is the essential framing, and what are the important public policy questions that people should be grappling with today?
I did a episode on former Japanese leader Shinzo Abe after his assassination. And as part of the prep for the episode, there was I read a speech he gave in the mid 2000s, and he said at a core level, his mission when it came to Japan is preparing Japan. This isn't an exact quote, but preparing Japan for the ravages of the 21st century. The Japan that Shinzo Abe found himself in the mid 2000s was Japan that in many ways was focused on the 20th century for very obvious reasons. Imperial Japan was obviously a disaster, and the second half of the 20th century is all about finding ways to reconcile Japan to the end of militarism, to the new economy, to technology, to the lost decade of the 1990s. And his point is that the 21st century is going to look much more like the 19th century. Great power conflict, danger, nationalism. So he saw his mission as helping in Japan focus on the 20th century, focus on the 21st century. I think we need our own version of that in the American political system today. And that's the number one issue I think every politician, every citizen should be focused on. They should be focused on the fact that if we find different ways to articulate how we feel our society is broken, how we feel as if our social structures don't make any sense, why we're skeptical of democracy and liberalism broadly, I think we find these feelings emerging because just in many ways, the country and its systems, its politics, its expectations, its performance metrics are suited for the 20th century, not the 21st. So that at a core level is what everyone should basically be focused on. This question of what does the world actually look like versus the world that we've been told to expect, and how do we adjust our actions accordingly?
So on that note, let me ask you this. How do you separate, because you guys, when you created the realignment, I think the thinking was that we were going through a political realignment, or we were going to go through a political realignment in the United States. I don't know how much of that was also like thinking globally, that a lot of the stuff that we're seeing here, we were going to see in Europe. But how do you reconcile that, which people I think have been much, as citizens, have been much more engaged on questions of domestic policy, naturally, with the fact that our foreign policy now, which was this sort of sturdy thing, this constant that remained, regardless of what was going on internally in domestic politics, there was a sense that there was a foreign policy consensus and the experts sort of were managing it. Obviously, the Iraq War and the forays in the Middle East caused the populace to become much more skeptical about the sort of competency of elites. How do we navigate this, which is that both of these now are up for grabs, that our foreign policy consensus, there's no consensus on foreign policy. We're sort of coming to grips with what America's role should be in the world, given the rise of China, given what's going on in Europe. Now we have the Middle East also. Middle East policy has been changing, and domestic politics, where we've got the Republican Party, which is still trying to figure out who it is, and the Democratic Party, which really hasn't even begun that process of death and resurrection yet, with Joe Biden as its head. How do you sort of navigate those two?
They're tied together. It's really interesting. The more, it was again, as a listener of the podcast, I know you've been reading some of the books I've been reading. So like you've mentioned Confronting Saddam Hussein by Melvin P. Leffler.
What is your view of that book? Did you finish it? I'm almost done with it.
Yeah, my problem with the book is I don't quite, no, here's the thing. So it's a good book. I found it a frustrating book because on the one hand, it does something very useful, which is push aside this idea that the Iraq War is just this conspiracy, which too many people in the popular public just think is, oh, it's a conspiracy. I think the number one problem I have with our Iraq War discourse is too many people assume that George W. Bush like literally told a lie about weapons of mass destruction. He didn't actually think they were there. It's all manufactured, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't like that story because it's just not true, and people should read a book like that. If you read any of these books, you could read Robert Draper's To Start a War. It's very consistently understood that they believed there were weapons, and they made all these.
Well, even the majority of people who thought it was a bad idea to go to Iraq believed that he had weapons of mass destruction.
Exactly.
I mean, almost everyone thought that because we had the quote receipts. Remember, that was the sort of no one had really thought to themselves he could be blustering that he has weapons of mass destruction because he wants to deter potential regional competitors from invading Iraq or, putting pressure on the country.
100%. And that's why I welcome any book that just makes that point clear. The frustrating aspect of the book, though, for me is I think Melvin Leffler is just way too credulous when it comes to saying, this is why it made sense for George W. Bush from his perspective to invade Iraq, because that just is ridiculous to me. I was in fifth grade, so my opinion doesn't count. The Iraq War was stupid to me when I was in fifth grade. It's stupid to me now. The number one judgment I make of any leader, especially on the Republican side, is, are you willing to understand how not only did the implementation of the Iraq War go disastrously, but knowing what you knew then, it was still a bad idea. And I think, once again, it's still just too credulous when it comes to that fact.
Yeah, I'm not done with the book yet. I'm more than halfway through, and my biggest frustration, there are parts of it that I really like. I also found it really transportative reading it because it brings me back to a certain time in American politics that were so much more simple to understand, where America was the primary actor in the world, and it was all about let's get our policy right and everything else will work out. So there was that sort of emotional thing that always happens to me whenever I go back in time to the early 2000s. But what I felt with the book, and I still want to have him on when I'm done reading it because I want to talk about this period. But what I felt with the book is that he's too close to the sources. He must. My sense was he has a very good relationship with everybody that he interviewed, pretty much. He was more interested and he was more interested. This is my perception, by the way, subjective opinion, without even knowing the guy. My sense is that he was more concerned with having a good relationship with the power sources and maintaining that relationship and sort of doing a history in a way that doesn't piss anybody off than he wasn't actually being viciously honest about about that whole period. Because most of the book is actually spent sort of putting unnecessary context, subjective context around the events that led up to the Iraq War than it was actually about just being viciously objective about the facts and what we know, you know? So
Yeah.
One more question on this, because I pulled you off of where you were going, and I don't want you to forget where you were going, but you said that you knew. So I was also openly against the Iraq War, but that's because I was a college student who was studying political science and had teachers who explained and broke down for me, one in particular that I've talked about on this podcast before, who broke down exactly why Iraq was not a nation state the way that Americans and Western Europeans think of nation states, that the Kurds, that the Shiites, the Sunnis, that the tribal dimensions of the country could lead to a civil war, that the Shiite majority could align with Iran, that this whole situation, in other words, could be destabilizing. How did you understand why it was a bad idea as a fifth grader?
Yeah, that's a great question because it forced me to think deeply about this. Here's my answer. I was in fourth grade when 9/11 happened. So as young as you could be and remember everything, that's when I didn't even know what because when it first happened, my mom said, oh, it must have been a Palestinian, because if you think of most of the hijackings in the 60s and 70s, a lot of those were PLO Palestinians. So I was like, what's a Palestinian?
And you come from a Ukrainian Jewish background, right? Your
yeah. So it was
there's that additional perspective.
Dynamic perspective there. So this is my introduction to the world of the 2000s. But because I was in Oregon growing up, I was so separate from 9/11. No family members were killed. We didn't know anybody. I think my dad may have known a few people, but just no direct relation on my part. So while Afghanistan just made sense to me, I didn't have a broader bloodlust that I probably would have had if 9/11 happened today and a bunch of friends of mine in New York had died, or friends of mine in DC had died. Because the more and more I read about the Iraq war, because I think it desperately needs to be separated from the war in Afghanistan. It's a huge mistake we've made, is just compressing these two into the forever wars when they're just entirely different wars, for good or for ill.
And compressing Afghanistan, this is something you've talked about before. Afghanistan, you could really think of it as a multi-part war. And thinking of it as a single war is actually, like the way we think of Iraq, is very different.
It's very different. It doesn't make any sense. We should understand that September 12th, until bin Laden's kicked out of the country and the Taliban overthrown, is an entirely different war than 2009. The Obama administration is debating whether or not to surge more troops into the country. That's a different war than after 2011, when Osama bin Laden is now dead, and there's a debate what's actually going to happen here. So once again, it should not be treated as one war. So I think the point, though, is the more I read about these books, the more I understand the Iraq war as basically being a reactionary example of bloodlust over what happened in 9/11. And at the end of the day, not catching bin Laden, Afghanistan was just too small when it came to stating the feelings that people heard. So I think I was just so separate from all of that. I couldn't even articulate what I just articulated. I didn't have the emotional awareness and understanding. I just think that without that feeling, and also without the understanding of the deeper issues, it just didn't make any sense to me. And so that's that. So there's nothing deep there. It's just, I think it's more about what I didn't feel, which I definitely, to be fair to myself, I would have definitely felt if I was 23 years old working in think tanks in DC. So I'm not going to pretend this is just sort of like at all times in my life, I would have made the right call when it came to the war, but that's just how I thought about it.
It's interesting because you were in a progressive part of the country. you were naturally inclined towards a more pacifist perspective, even if you didn't really understand why.
Yes.
Sounds like what you're saying. It's interesting though. I don't know that I would agree that Iraq was about bloodlust. I mean, I get the desire to go into Afghanistan and the desire to do something as quickly as possible because the American people wanted it. You wanted somebody to bomb. But I think Iraq to me, and this is where Confronting Saddam, that book we were talking about before, does a good job of highlighting this, which is really important and something that I didn't really appreciate at the time. And that has to do with just how intractable a foreign policy dilemma Iraq was and Saddam was, and how ruthless he was. I mean, he was so ruthless. The book does a good job of actually going into some of his backstory a bit. But I think about that now, given my perspective today and how much more I know, what my opinion would be at that time if I got perhaps caught too much into the policy debate. And this is what worries me about today, and I'd love to actually do this with you, Marshall, at some point. I worry that what ends up happening sometimes is that people like me or you who have spent enough time studying these issues begin to try to sort of piece things out and try to push the envelope on the margin. So how do we solve the Iraq problem, right? And I wonder if this is the same problem that all policymakers face, whether it's in geopolitics, whether it's in monetary affairs. They attempt to manage the world, to manage the economy. And in the process of doing that, I wonder if invariably we make the situation worse. And this is such a difficult sort of question to answer, right? Because it's not like you get dropped into a world at ground zero and every time we get to start over. It's not like every new president gets a brand new slate, right? You enter the world as it was handed to you. And so the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the perfect example of this. I mean, this is a conflict that's been going on for a very long time. And any sort of judgment one brings to the table has to take into account the situation as it is today, So anyway, we can talk about that, but I pulled you from what we went on this detour on Iraq because you originally brought up I think you brought up Leifer's book. Where were you going with that before we went on this tangent, and then we can always revisit it.
Yeah, totally. And just one record correction. I was expressing the emotional, just once again, reading from a lot of the principles, I would reduce a lot of the emotional state after 9/11 as bloodlust, but I don't think that was the literal cause. I think the literal cause of the Iraq war was a serious and intellectually defensible assessment that 9/11 happened because the U.S. wasn't forward facing when it came to threats. We treated Osama bin Laden in the 1990s like he was an issue for the FBI to be resolved rather than an issue for military power to resolve. So they see the threat of Iraq. They say, okay, if we're not going to take a threat seriously in the 90s, what's a threat that we couldn't take seriously today? That's Saddam Hussein, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not alleging it's all purely bloodlust. So it's all mixed together. But yeah, so in terms of where I was going, I deeply think the Iraq war is tied to our domestic policy debates, because when you combine the Iraq war with the 2008 financial crisis, they just together are just the complete evisceration of the bipartisan establishment consensus when it comes to foreign policy and economics in both respects. And ever since they happened, both parties have been essentially stuck in this position where they are philosophically listless, where people would secretly admit they don't know the answers, and therefore are only capable of, to your point, managing events as they happen. So my critique of Biden when it comes to the defense industrial base, like let's say, is I don't get the sense that if you chatted with the folks in the Biden administration when they were coming into office in 2021, that they had the evisceration of the defense industrial base at the top of their priority list. I understand why that wasn't a factor. That's not the way you're thinking of a post-COVID period. But once the crisis actually happens, and then we have to fix everything, they're on the spot, they're managing. I relatively trust them to manage the fires now that they've actually started. But I just think at a broader level, my central critique of both political parties and the various political philosophies within is that we just find ourselves kind of running around consistently using, fire suppressant or a fire extinguisher against little fires, rather than simply saying, hey, why do these fires keep breaking out in this building of ours? And what can we do to both A, make the building more fire retardant? So like, do we need to like install new panels or have new doors? So that's part one. There's the foundational aspect, but then there's two, how do we stop the fires happening in the first place? And I've yet to see either party offer a sustainable and politically feasible response to that.
So why is that? And this also brings up the recent, makes me think of the recent Foreign Affairs article by Jake Sullivan, which now we all know had two different versions. The print version, which was the original version, and then the version that he published after the events took place in Israel on October 7th. And while I'm very sympathetic to the fact that the world is dynamic, and I'm not one of those people that always harps on every sort of mistake that policymakers make. I think that's disingenuous and cynical. I do also at the same time wonder how the Biden administration, with all the intelligence that it has, could not have foreseen the attacks, but been more humble about the potential for violence to break out or the potential for instability in the Middle East. And this folds back into the larger question that I'm really asking, which is like, why is it that they're still putting out fires? Is it incompetency in the organization itself, in the executive, that they don't have the right people, they don't have the right ideas, they don't have the right process? Or is it the politics that it's so difficult politically to put forward and implement the kinds of policies that would be needed to move the aircraft carrier, not the literal aircraft carrier, but the sort of metaphorical aircraft carrier of U.S. grand strategy, from where it's been pointed at all these years to a new direction that the American people will support, and that doesn't become just another hot button political issue that gets used for campaign fodder during the election cycle?
Yeah, great question. Look, this happened. The reason why. So here's the thing, and this happened to the Trump administration. This happened to both administrations, because both administrations, at their core, regret the Bush and Obama years when it comes to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East specifically. If you are a Democrat, especially the Democrats who tend to staff the mid and higher levels of policy, you regret the forever wars, you regret Iraq. And if you're a Republican, you are going to basically say to yourself, Obama mismanaged ISIS, Obama withdrew from Iraq, red lines in Syria went awash. And this is just a region which is pure chaos, when we have this different future that's Asian focused, right? There's a reason why the Obama administration had to pivot to Asia, Trump administration had to pivot to Asia, Biden administration pivoted to Asia. So essentially what happened here is that Jake Sullivan found himself kind of playing a horrible game of musical chairs, and that multiple administrations have needed the Middle East to be something we could just move on from. So the reason why he's writing that initial version of the Foreign Affairs article that's talking about the stability, Israel, Palestine, the Middle East broadly, is that is a story that basically everyone needs to be true. Because if that story is true, then it means that the Biden administration can continue to have a positive energy-centric relationship with MBS and the Saudis. It means that the policy towards Iran with the nuclear deal was working. It means that you could focus on Eastern Europe with Russia. It means you could focus on the Asia Pacific. And if you're Trump, you could say that you've brought peace to the Middle East. You've disproved the foreign policy establishment correct, because once again, the conventional wisdom before 2016 was you couldn't move the embassy to Jerusalem. You couldn't make a peace deal in the Middle East that didn't revolve around solving the Palestinian question. This was just a convenient story. And I think that Jake Sullivan ended up just being the final person to get caught with it. Because this story, as we're now seeing, whether it's the Iran policy, the fact that Iran is just like obviously the instigator in the region with its proxies, whether it's the Trump administration over exaggerating how simpatico the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia were with Israel when it came to Iran. Obviously, there are calls between the Iranians and the Saudis after the Palestinian uprising really started after Israel struck back after 10/7. So it's an inconvenient story, and I think that's the first thing you have to really understand. At a broader level, and this is where I think your point about by trying to manage things, do we essentially get trapped into making things worse? I don't think the United States has done anything in the region to make things worse, in the sense that it's not as if the United States has encouraged the dynamics that really blew apart on 10/7. I think Americans are actually very.
So just to be clear, when you say to make things worse, you mean just recently to make.
Yeah, because recently, because let me put it this way, like I'd modify your statement about the issue of management, which is there are two things here. So there are issues that can be solved, and there are issues that need to be managed. And the central flaw of our Iraq policy in 2002 was that Saddam was a problem, but he was a problem that needed to be managed, not solved.
Up until 2002.
Well, no, fly zones. That should have been the consensus moving forward.
It should have been the consensus, but the Bush administration sought to solve the problem.
They sought to solve the problem. It's kind of funny because if you read,
that's such a brilliant framing, actually, to distinguish between what is a solvable problem and what is a problem that needs to be managed.
And it's so funny because if you read Melvin Leffler's work, you read Donald Rumsfeld or Doug Feith or a lot of the Iraq war defenders, they're saying, well, the policy wasn't sustainable. What were we going to do? Keep using the no-fly zone, launching the airstrike against their things every 6 months? I'm like, yeah, we actually should have just done that. If we just actually add up the price of what we ended up spending in Iraq versus the price we were spending on the actual policy, we actually could have just done that.
We can actually look at a comparable example, which is North Korea. North Korea did go nuclear. Now, North Korea being nuclear is less of a problem than Iraq being nuclear. So I understand the concerns about that happening in the Middle East because of Israel, and Israel is also a nuclear power, and it's a much more unstable region than the North Korean peninsula, than the Korean peninsula. But one could make the argument that we would have been better off having managed Iraq than we were better off having managed North Korea than if we actually tried to invade North Korea. Just like
and that's what
the analogy with Iraq, yeah.
And exactly. And just because, and it wasn't just the North Korean nuke that's prevented us from doing that. It's the fact that, Seoul is so close to North Korea that the civilian Japan, the casualties, there was too high of a cost. The cost, this is actually a good way to put this, but the cost of solving North Korea is so obvious that no one would actually propose doing it. The disaster of our Iraq policy was the cost of solving the issue wasn't immediately obvious. And instead, we've had to find out over the next 20 years. So yeah, just at a core level, we understand, we misunderstand what needs to be managed versus what needs to be solved. But the problem now is, I would venture that most people behind closed doors would say, look, we're not going to solve the Middle East. We're going to manage the Middle East. We just find ourselves in these awkward situations, like once again, 10/7, where we're still dealing with the fallout of the past 20 years. And you can't say the solve versus managed. Actually, here's where the solve versus managed debate comes into effect. This is the debate that Israel needs to have when it comes to how they handle Hamas moving forward. Is Hamas something that could be solved via crushing them militarily, or is it something that needs to ultimately be managed? And I think the problem that a lot of critics of Israel's policy have, and a lot of critics of the Biden administration's support of Israel have, is that obviously you could find a variety of people at center-right think tanks who before October 7th were arguing that Hamas is this like terroristic, irreconcilable, Iran-backed terroristic entity. But I think there are plenty of people on the center left and in the center who would say, no, actually, this can't be managed. Given what happened on 10/7, I think that Hamas transitioned from something that could be managed to something that has to be solved. So I think that's a way of applying the metric we have here. And this is kind of like the question that I raised for proponents of the ceasefire. Because I want to be very generous to them, because obviously the civilian deaths are horrific. The consequences are horrible. But oftentimes a lot of critics of the policy will say various things. They'll say something like, oh, yes, of course, Hamas has to go. Of course, we can't go back to the pre-10/7 status quo. However, we still have to do this ceasefire. I've yet to see an articulation of a long-term ceasefire, but doesn't return us to that 10-6 status quo, where we see Hamas as something that's manageable versus something so awful that clearly the Palestinians will have no self-determination so long as Hamas is a serious power. So long as Hamas is there as an Iranian proxy, committing pogroms, there's no way Israelis will give the Palestinians any ground. And it's also kind of funny too, because you see a lot of people on the left basically saying, like, why can't Biden force Netanyahu to do X, Y, and Z? Why can't he force a ceasefire the way that we essentially pressured Israelis to do a ceasefire in 2021 or in previous eras during the 1980s? Reagan did this, George H.W. Bush did this, Biden did this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The main difference here is that the Israelis saw either the PLO or Hamas as being a manageable thing where there's a debate on how we handle it, versus now, even if we were to magically say, hey, Israel, if you don't do a ceasefire, we won't send you an aid package next year, I think the Israelis still go. That's just, there's been a real failure. I think supporters of the ceasefire have been so focused on critiquing the broad structures of Israeli policy, which I think in many respects needs to actually happen, that they've failed to understand the specific policy moment that Israelis are responding to. Israeli politics is not focused on how to resolve the Palestinian question. The Israeli question, the political system is focused on, hey, how at a military level do we prevent 10/7 from ever happening again?
You know, to use your framework, I wonder if Israel itself, its existence is a problem that needs to be managed. In other words, its existence is so unstable in that part of the world that it's not clear. And this is a point that I made either in my conversation with, maybe I did it with both Kamran Bahari and with Walter Russell Mead. I think Mead disagreed with me maybe, but disagreed with me in making the point that Israel was so unique in this case. But in my view, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is like a problem for which there isn't even a good theoretical solution. And so when we're talking about Hamas, in terms of solving Hamas, what does that look like to you? Because to me, solving Hamas is not something that can happen militarily. So how do you see that? What does a solution there look like?
Yeah, so I'll probably echo my Hudson colleague, Walter Russell Mead, when I actually say that before the 2000s, I think it was easy to argue that Israel was inherently a destabilizing feature in the region.
No. But let me just say, I don't mean it that way. I don't mean that Israel is a destabilizing force in the region. I mean that Israel's own place in the region is unstable. That if you're a policymaker in Israel and you want to have a safe country, and you want to provide the security for your state, that the state of Israel as it's currently constituted is by its nature unstable at this point in time. Maybe in some future period, 100, 1,000 years from now, whatever, it won't be. But right now, based on the politics in the region, based on the Iranian threat and a number of other factors, and the story that people have in their heads about its legitimacy, that it's unstable, that its security dynamic isn't stable, because there's a political problem that hasn't been resolved. That's what
and the reason I'm just pushing back, thanks for restating, is just that the relationship with Jordan's pretty great. The relationship with Egypt's pretty great. This is the strongest the relationship's been. So yeah, okay, but this is fair. I think we could agree. I think we could agree. I think we could agree with the point you're making. I guess my quibble is just that it seems as if things at least were on an upswing. So if you're an Israeli policymaker, you probably, especially this year, felt the most stable regionally that Israel has ever felt.
With your Arab interlocutors, with the Arab states at the leadership level, not on the Arab street, and certainly not with the Palestinians. That's what I'm trying to say. Like, for sure, the Arabs want peace. It's very clear. MBS wants to move on from this issue. Okay, and he understands that the biggest threat to him is not Israel; it's Iran. So, but the thing is that there's an underlying foundation that's unstable, both in public opinion in the Arab world in general, which impacts these kingdoms, and also with the Palestinians. That's the single most important one.
No, that's true. I'll agree to that. There's this is the thing with podcasting. My disagreements would probably have to be like written in terms of like we're getting like that unhelpfully nuanced. But yeah, I broadly agree with your statement. So here's the question about Hamas militarily. Look, the second this happened, I compared, on Twitter, ISIS to Hamas, Hamas to ISIS. Because here's my problem, and this is my problem with folks who say, look, ultimately, we have to understand Hamas as a structural reality of Israel not allowing the Palestinians to have a state or resolving their question. This is a structural reality, and until we resolve that structural reality, you are just not going to have a peaceful, stable Israel. Mm-hmm. Here's my problem with that story, because once again, these are all stories. This is not provable. No one actually knows. Mm-hmm. My problem with that story is actually quite literally the example of ISIS. So it's the year 2012. The United States left Iraq the year before. Nouri al-Maliki is the leader of Iraq. He's a Shiite. He's in many ways allied and friendly with Iran. And per the decades of Saddam's Sunni-led discrimination against the Shiite majority in Iraq, you're now seeing a bunch of payback. So not only did you see a horrific quasi-civil war in 2006 until the surge stabilized the country, but you're now seeing Sunnis not able to get jobs in government. They're not getting the economic support they should be getting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because in many ways, a huge failure of the Obama administration is, despite all of George W. Bush's very clear flaws, he was very engaged with al-Maliki towards the latter end of Bush's presidency, which meant that there's advice, and they're doing all these weekly calls. There's talk about how do you reconcile your population. This is as soon as we leave in 2011, once again, understandably, because we were trying to wash our hands of this Iraq problem and pivot.
And being occupiers is a fundamental problem, period.
Yeah. And
being seen as occupiers.
Being seen as occupiers is a fundamental problem. So we're moving on. But, and this is the critique of Obama, you should have kept checking up on Iraqi society. So the reason why this relates to Palestine is as follows. In 2012, there's increasing discrimination. Sunnis are getting more and more ticked off. Within a year, you have the Syrian civil war emerge, the region continues to stabilize, and then you have all these radicals pouring across the Syrian border into Iraq. They ally with the remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Ba'ath Party that had escaped to the western parts of Iraq. And then these radical Islamist groups are able to juxtapose their radical ideology onto a Sunni population that's been demonstrably terribly mistreated by the Shiite majority. So there's a world where we could have said the following. Yes, we need to combat ISIS, but ultimately we need to understand ISIS, despite its radicalism, despite the beheadings, despite lighting people on fire, despite rolling people over bulldozers and destroying the monuments and everything. We have to understand ISIS as emerging from the structural realities of Iraq in 2013, 2014, which were Shiite discrimination. And until we resolve the Shiite discrimination, until we actually maybe we need to do the Joe Biden plan and cut Iraq into different states. Maybe the actual construct of Iraq doesn't make any sense. Until we resolve those, any military actions we take against ISIS are not going to solve the problem. It's going to be whack-a-mole. Obviously there were a bunch of changes within Iraqi society over the next decade. But what we actually did was, under the Obama and Trump administration, prosecute an aggressive kinetic war against ISIS, and we eliminated them. So my intuition from that story, from that actual situation is, actually, I'm not quite sure how structural Hamas is versus Hamas is a problem that needs to be eliminated. And once again, I think that's just like the key thing is, which I think there are legitimate lessons to be taken from the example of ISIS's elimination, because we were actually able to literally do that. Now the cost could be too high for that, but I just want to reject categorically the idea that we have to start with saying there's no military solution to these problems, because there have been plenty of military solutions to radical extremist groups that have tens of thousands of members and leadership cadres who hold power over like actual territory.
It's interesting. I'm definitely don't want to go over my skis here because I don't, I'm not an, I'm not an expert on the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict beyond having read some books and just absorbed stuff over the last 20 years.
Same
But
here.
I do think, and I think you'd probably agree that uh, ISIS, the relationship of ISIS to the people of Mosul and to Iraq was very different than Hamas. And so I think, and also the extent to which, and we don't know exactly the extent to which Hamas is supported by Palestinians in Gaza versus the relationship of ISIS to the people of Mosul. Um, my sense is that it's the extent to which the Israelis are seen as occupiers and as an unwelcome force in Gaza makes the problem much more difficult to solve. And I feel like while the Israelis are completely justified in defending their country, I don't know that this. I don't know. I guess my response to you is, well, I don't know, and I keep saying I don't know. My sense is that there is no military solution to Hamas. Certainly, they could defeat Hamas as an organization, but then the structural things could allow for another organization like it or worse to come out of the area. So I guess that's sort of where I fall on it. And at the same time, I don't know what a political solution would look like that would be acceptable to the majority of Israelis and that would also be acceptable to the Palestinians because the Palestinians are also divided on this issue. There's no singular leadership organization that represents them that the Israelis can positively negotiate with.
The way that I'd put it is, and this is the second half of my Iraq story, because if you're right, if basically Obama administration undersecretary for blank Marshall at the DOD in 2015 says, look, we're going to kill everyone in ISIS. That's our policy. Even Iraq's good to go. That would actually be incorrect. Because like I said, there was an actual structural problem with the treatment of the Sunnis in the country. So yes, you do have to do both things. So what I would say in these, but here's, and this is the difficult point. So here's why the Israeli and then Iraq and ISIS Hamas situation is comparable. At a core level, ISIS had reached such a level of existential threat to the Iraqi status quo that you were not going to actually resolve those underlying structural issues until it was no longer in the driver's seat.
Well, I think you need both, right? So yeah, I agree with that. I think you need both.
Yeah. So this is, and you're right, because this is the worst case scenario under what I'm saying. So let's say Israel can at terrible cost horrifically more than decimate Hamas. If we just return to 10-6, the status quo, assuming that's just fine, that isn't going to be a long-term solution. So for example, there's been this, we need something funny in this like very morbid discourse, but there's been a bunch of discourse online, because you see a lot of pro ceasefire people basically saying, like, if Israel goes in and kills Hamas but also kills civilians, that's just going to radicalize the next generation, and then this is going to continue forever and ever. This is like the ceasefire argument. What a bunch of conservatives and center left people are arguing is that's just like saying, well, we really can't go after the Japanese after Pearl Harbor, we really can't go after the Germans after D-Day, because that's just going to radicalize the next generation when all their fathers are killed. Which I think is a good point if we're doing like a Twitter debate. But the deeper point is that we should understand Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan as actually, there were underlying structural issues beyond just the militarism of Imperial Japan and like the Nazi Party. There was a Germany whose role in Europe was not reconciled. There was a broader, deeply since the Napoleonic era, unstable security situation in Europe that required the United States to remain on the continent for more than 60 years afterwards to resolve. So when you combined the US and the broader European Union resolving many of the German questions with the fact that we then killed the Nazis, that solved the problem. So the concern when it comes to Israel is going to be, if Israel does not take the opportunity after whatever conclusion they take the Hamas war to resolve those underlying issues, to do these things both at the same time, that is going to take you back to 10-6. So I think we should understand not going back. I think this is one thing, and this is me trying to be good faith. I think I accomplished this in my podcast. I need both sides to articulate their own version of why we're not just going back to 10-6, 2023 before the attack, because it has to change everyone's perspective and approach to this.
Yeah, you know, one of the problems that I had on 8/7 and 8/8, you know, the days around the attack, was people who were doing the equivalent thing that others in the U.S. did on 9/11 or a few days after, which was, sure, yes, these attacks are bad, but we did arm the Mujahideen. You know, and I think that there is part of the problem also is that because America's an empire, our policy debates involve the nuances of other people's civil wars or conflicts or whatever. And at the end of the day, like, there is no, I agreed with that statement that who was it that came out of Saudi Arabia, was the foreign minister or somebody, said that there are no perpetrators in this conflict. There are no something, only victims. There are only victims in this conflict. I generally agree with that. I don't agree with the framing that Israel is the victim or Palestinians are the victim. I think that this is one of those hopeless entanglements and messes that it's to take a sort of to sort of view this conflict and say there's a clear moral right and a clear moral wrong. I think absolves people. It hand waves away the difficulty to be thrown, and this goes back to my point, like, we're thrown in the middle of this. You know, we're trying to make the best of the situation as it is, which is why fundamentally I'm so frustrated with the cynicism in American politics. When, for example, Russia invaded Ukraine, you had the people that wanted to excuse that by pointing at all the things that we've done wrong, including our policy with Russia, rather than pointing out, like, this is a line in the sand. Like, we do not accept territorial expansion on the European continent. We don't accept people changing borders in the post-World War II era or the post-Cold War era. And so I think that's, it's just sort of, you know, part of the issue. And I think a lot of people in the country are generally, and I understand, exhausted from these conversations, because there is a kind of like, we don't want this. We want to go back to some idyllic isolationist America, you know, where we can have we can focus more on personal freedom. That's another problem too. With all the changes in technology, you need to have a stronger state and stronger regulations. So another area, now I'm kind of jumping everywhere, but another area that I've been frustrated with is,
can I say something?
Yeah, please do. Please interrupt.
I just want to echo what you said, and actually echo something you said in a previous podcast I was listening to. What you just described, though, is actually why I'm optimistic about the generational change we're experiencing as a country right now. Because to your point, Mujahideen, US Army Mujahideen, which, broadly speaking, is someone who actually interviewed the guy who kind of formulated the policy, I think is an entirely defensible policy, but I would go back in time and also support that decision. A lot of the history there with, like, oh, we didn't arm bin Laden. Those are totally different groups of people. Like, but I think that was a correct decision to take. But the point is, I was born in 1992. I'm 31 now. I literally, if I'm ever a policymaker, if someone raised that, I'll be like, yeah, I had literally nothing to do with that. My cohort has nothing to do with that. You were saying this on your defense-based privatization episode. You were saying what's so interesting about this podcast is I'm now getting of the age where everyone I'm interviewing is a similar age to me. I mean, obviously, like, you're a bit older than me, but we still have a lot of the same, like, generational touchstones.
It's wild.
So in the same way that, like, at a certain point, American policymakers stopped being dunked on over decisions we made with interventions in the Western Hemisphere in the 1910s or 1920s, dollar diplomacy, just because it just was not relevant. That's what Afghanistan is going to fade into. And this is, once again, this is why generational change is important. New narratives. I could say, look, wow, my grandparents made a variety of horrible decisions, everything from Vietnam to excess during the Cold War. I just did an episode about how the CIA effectively assassinated the leader of independent Congo in 1960 because of Cold War propaganda and paranoia, Patrice Lumumba. That had nothing to do with you and I. Like literally, it had nothing to do with it. Like we obviously are the moral inheritors of that. So I cannot say, nope, that has nothing to do with me. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to read it. No, I have to, because those mistakes should guide how we think of the problems of the world. But it's much harder for the US to argue against Putin's actions in Ukraine if the CIA station chief who orchestrated that assassination in 1960 is still in power. He's long dead. So once again, I was thinking, I'm just excited because the more you delve into this, the more the hypocrisy and whataboutism is going to become increasingly irrelevant. And we had the ability to kind of like have agency and say, no, look, I'm defending Ukraine because this is what I believe about the world. I'm not a hypocrite. I didn't make the decision that you're citing and are expecting to trip me up. And we're still kind of in an awkward position where I think people in our cohort still get a little too tripped up by it. But I think they should just be confident and say, yeah, that was a bad call. Just as we agree the CIA made bad calls in the Cold War, that doesn't change my moral agency since I'm sitting in the chair today. But yeah, go on to the point I just wanted to say that.
No, it's okay. Actually, I'm going to move us to the second hour now, Marshall. I want to focus on domestic politics, and I also want to talk about a conversation that you and Sagar had recently in your Ask Me Anything segment, where you talked about this construct of World War III and why you guys felt like that's not a helpful construct, and why you in particular are not actually concerned about that happening, at least not immediately. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Yeah, but I want to delve into that because I feel like there might be some areas where we disagree, and I want to get clear on where that is and where that isn't. For anyone new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Marshall, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Marshall, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed.